Thank you, sir. Am I both audible and visible?
Yes, you are audible and visible. Yes.
Thank you so much, sir. So I was given the task to find out the importance of the phrase the placid light. So here I go.
Yes,
The
continue.
moon, the queen of the silver bow, in Charlotte Smith's poem in Sonnet 4 to the moon. The speaker of the poem, probably Charlotte Smith, is directly addressing the moon and speaking to it. Therefore, subjectivity is presented here. The sonnet is filled with so much imagery and description. Despite of all the pessimistic and depressing thoughts, Smith is able to portray the moon as a beautiful creation. The moon can be compared to heaven. In the poem, quote unquote, by thy pale beam, poet refers to the silver pale light of the moon. Luminous nature of silver has been associated with the moon and the feminine energy. Femininity, it is referred to Diana and Artemis and given the feminine epithet Queen of Night. But Smith imbues it with an air of authority who controls the violence of the sea, unlike her contemporaries like Young, who has portrayed the moon as soft, modest, melancholy, female, and fair. Smith's moon symbolizes stability, eternity, and consistency. She imagines the moon as the symbol of heavenly peace and serenity, which not only symbolizes heaven, but the thoughts of the heaven that gives comfort to the living through the soothing influence of it, quote unquote, mild and placid light. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shudeshna, for your presentation. So you talked about different aspects of the poem, especially with reference to the representation of moon symbology, how Young had presented that as a feminine symbol, and how this has been converted into an eternal maternal symbol in the poem. You also have drawn our attention to the pattern of imagery of the poem. So we will move on to Shudeshna Shaha. Let us hear her, what she has to say about the poem. Shudeshna Shaha, please.
Good evening, sir. May I
Yes, you are,
start?
yes, you are audible. Yeah, you can make yourself visible if you want to be.
No, sir, I don't want to.
Okay, continue.
In Charlotte Smith's Sonnet 4 to the Moon, the speaker is directly addressing and describing the beauty of the moon. With the use of many imageries, the moon is described in the poem. The moon is considered to be the heaven in comparison with earth. The poem starts with a dim description, but towards the end, it gives a ray of hope. With the words like pale, alone, pensive, the poet described the loneliness and saddened situation of the moon. Its light falls, quote start, upon my troubled breast, quote unquote, shows the tenderness of the moon. Where the earth is considered to be the place of sin, the moon is on the other hand is considered to be the place heaven filled with peacefulness. Moon is place with no evil and conflict, only calmness that gives peace at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Shudeshna Shah. So you also talked about the contrast between the heavenly presence of moon and the earthly world of pain and sorrows. You referred to the different aspects of the poem, and I'm quite grateful for you. We're grateful to you for the presentation. So it should have been a bit longer. You should have taken some more time, a few more words on the poem. So we move on to the next presenter, Shurabhi Roy. Yes, Shurabhi, make your presentation, please. Shurabhi, you are there on the line?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Yes, make your presentation, please.
Okay, sir. Great. Today I will be analyzing the fair planet of the night. Um, by reading this poem, we can understand that this poem is a romantic sonnet. In the first part of the poem, we can find a subdued mood, but it gradually changes and ends up with a happy mood. We have the image of the moon not only in the traditional senses but also in symbolic ways. That is heaven. Here, the queen of the silver bow is is personification of the moon, and the moon is imagined in a personage of Diana, the goddess of classical antiquity of Greek mythology. Um, heavenly powers. Uh, these are contained within the symbol of moon. Um, so Diana is holding a silver bow, and she is a queen. This The poem moves from traditional images, but the moon is not sorrowful. The beams are pale, and it is the fair planet of the night. Here, the moon symbology is used to suggest maternal love and affection, and the troubled soul in the in the sublunary world that is below the moon. Thank you, sir. That's it. Hello, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Shuravi, for your excellent presentation. So you have drawn our attention
Thank
to
you,
so
sir.
many areas of the poem. So can you hear me? Yes. Okay,
Yes, sir.
okay. So we just move on to our next presenter. So is there online, Shushmita, you are there online?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Shushmita, make your presentation, please.
Sir, I will be analyzing upon the fact that the sufferers of the earth, the way they feel, their suffering and pain is eased away by the heavenly moon. In sonnet number 4, Charlotte Smith describes the moon as an object or place of rest or relief from the earthly sufferings and pain. The words used in this poem are mostly dark and bitter, which is a fine contrast to the glowy moon. The dark words brightens the effect of moon in the poem. In literature, moon imagery has always been used as a strong symbol which is associated with supernatural or mythical powers. With the use of dark words, Smith shows the darkness of art's nature. Earthly creatures' countless sins and follies makes them suffer. Earthly sufferings are unbearable and make earthly creatures restless. The way the moon shines, it takes superior control over the dark night sky and provides a sense of enlightenment. Moon is used as a symbol of heaven here. Smith creates a perfect contrast between the darkness and the light, more specifically between the earthly sufferings and the escape to peace. In line number 9, more specifically, Charlotte Smith states that the sufferings will end and the heavenly moon will provide the earthly sufferers the sense of peace that they want. The darkness and the sufferings will dissolve and will be consumed by the heavenly moon. The way moonlight enlightens the darkness, in the same way sufferers will find the moonlight as a ray of hope to end their earthly dark sufferings. So that's it.
Okay, thank you, Shushmita, for your analysis. So you were
Okay, sir.
focused on that line that was assigned to you. Thank you for that. So you focused on the sufferers of the earth, and you drew a contrast between the lunar world of the
And the
Queen
earthly
of
world.
and the earthly world. Yeah, the contrast is also presented through a set of images. You also pointed out that. Thank you for your presentation. Sweta
Thank
Singh,
you, sir.
Sweta, you are there online? Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, make your presentation, please.
Charlotte Smith is a romantic. Yes, sir. Charlotte Smith is a romantic poet and novelist. In this poem, the moon poet uses as an object which is full of mystery and supernatural power. The moon can be considered as being a romantic element that appears in many poems. On the other hand, death represents darkness, which is very contradictory to the moon, which represents light. Mm, Smith Smith in this poem focuses on sympathy, suffering of human. In her poem, Smith shares the painful experiences because she feels that poetry renders sufferings visible to others. Just like in sonnet number 4, The Moon, poet uses the word death, which symbolizes rest or internal sleep. Poet describes that those people who are suffering from pain can find some rest, but also thinks that death can provide her rest, which can get rid her sorrow and suffering. In romantic era, even death was romantic. It can be considered a beautiful land full of dreams where people can escape from trouble, suffering, darkness, loneliness, just like Smith does in her poem. Romantic poets were very lean towards the feelings like sadness, melancholic, suffering, burden with social injustice, which can push human to get rid of these feelings and rest in peace. That's it, sir.
Thank you, Sweta, for your analysis of the line. You have analyzed the concept of death and how this benign sphere and the death world both are presented in the poem. So we move on to Toishali. Toishali, make your presentation, please.
Yes, sir. Here I'm assigned to analyze the word children in the sonnet to the moon by Charlotte Smith. The moon, the queen of the silver bow, is Charlotte Smith's topic in sonnet 4 to the moon. The speaker is directly talking about the moon. The moon is full of imagery. The tone of the poem is not constant. It starts with a melancholy tone, but when it reaches towards the end, it shows a happy place to be in. As the writer was in prison along with her husband, she always used to think of a happy place to be in. Spiritual connection is an important part of the sonnet. The worldly values that are imprinted in us gives us the notion of hell and heaven. So here the place moon stands as the epitome of happiness and peace for her. Towards the end of the sonnet, the word children gives us a new dimension about the poem. The representation of child labor and industrial revolution, that is basically the society of that time, is represented through that. Everybody imagines their own heaven. For Smith, it is the moon. The 14-line rhythmic poem with the set structure develops the theme of happiness, and this is what Charlotte Smith tries to say. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Toishali, for excellent analysis of the line with reference to the word children, children of despair and woe.
Yes, sir.
So we move on to our next presentation by Tiasha. Tiasha, make your presentation, please.
Yes, sir. To the Moon is Charlotte Smith's one of the famous sonnets where she excellently presents her idea. This sonnet is full of symbols. By using many symbols, the poetess presents the immense sufferings of human beings on the earth and also presents the moon as a place of rest. In this poem, the moon symbolizes both the maternal love and the heaven where men go after their death. Death releases men from the earthly sufferings. The poetess describes the sad people or the sufferers as the sad children of despair and woe. She says that they forget all their sufferings and pain in the realm of the moon. Their lips, which are full of sufferings, are symbolized by cup of sorrow. Cup of sorrow not only symbolizes the never-ending sufferings of human being on the earth, but it also emphasizes all the evils and sins which make their lives painful. Thus, Charlotte Smith symbolically presents the misery of human being as well as establishes her deep faith in afterlife. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tiasha, for your presentation. You have talked about the central theme of the poem, analyzed different aspects of the poem also. So with this,
Yes, sir.
we have come to a general understanding of the poem. By now, we know almost everything about the poem. The only thing that is left for us is to further our anatomy of criticism. So critical ways of looking at the poem. This is the next topic I am introducing. Okay, so if you want, you can make it interactive, or if you want, you can leave this as monologic. So according to you, whatever you want. If you want, just switch on your mic and speak. So I was talking about analyzing a poem or anatomy of a poem. So there are different ways by which we can read a poem. And these different ways of reading a poem shall be discussed today with reference to Charlotte Smith's poem To the Moon. As this poem was composed in 1784, and we have the first reception of the poem only during the Romantic period. So we shall first focus on the different aspects of Romantic criticism, how the Romantic critics would like to see this poem, look at this poem. Romantic criticism is different from the traditional structuralist way of looking at any art or literature. Romantic criticism is based on, primarily on, the French and the German schools of Romanticism. We have different schools of Romanticism, say French, German, English, Spanish. So among this, the French school of Romanticism and the German school of Romanticism, especially the German school of Romanticism, has given us certain critical tools for analysis. So it was with the first representation of the theme of Romanticism that we find in the works of writers like Goethe, Goethe, The Sorrow of Werther, where we have the first analysis in the text of the romantic mood and temperament. We also have The Robbers, as you remember, Schiller's The Robbers, where we have the presentation of this romantic theme. But in the field of criticism, Romantic criticism grew in the hands of primarily of the Schlegel brothers. Schlegel brothers, Friedrich Schlegel and his brother, they actually took up the works of William Shakespeare and started analyzing the works of Shakespeare. Before that, before the Romantic period, Shakespearean works were mainly analyzed keeping in mind the Aristotelian norms, the structuralist criticism. We have very good criticism of Shakespeare, especially in the hands of the new classical critics and poets like John Dryden, Alexander Pope, his contemporaries, and later on we have Dr. Samuel Johnson with his preface to Shakespeare, makes an excellent analysis of the works of Shakespeare. In neoclassical criticism, more emphasis was given primarily on the form of the text. But now with Romantic criticism, we have a new evolution. So when Schlegel brothers started analyzing Shakespearean works, they started focusing on the characters, how the characters are turned into living embodiment of nature. So Shakespeare was now regarded as a poet of nature. You remember Dr. Johnson in preface to Shakespeare also talked of Shakespeare as a poet of nature. And this was a kind of compliment to Shakespeare with an undertone that Shakespeare is not a classicist because he has mingled drama, tragedy and comedy, and he has structural flaws. So the classical rules cannot be properly applied to the works of Shakespeare, and yet Shakespeare is a great poet because Shakespeare is a poet of nature. Schlegel brother used this analysis of Dr. Johnson to show that Shakespeare is actually a poet of nature, not because he is natural poet, a genius, but because he is able to represent the aspect of nature, both internal human nature as well as external nature. So this was what Schlegel brother introduced in the study of Shakespearean plays. From Schlegel onwards, we have therefore a subjective reading of poetry that gives more emphasis on the psychological components present in the poem, and the mind of the poet is also taken into account. for analyzing the poem. So we have therefore two aspects in Charlotte Smith's sonnet to the moon. Number one, the creator, the maker of the poem, the writer of the poem, the poet. The second is the poem itself. So romantic criticism does not differentiate between the poet, the creator, and the poetry, the poem. So there is an integral relationship between the subject, I, who is writing, and the created world of the poem, the fiction that is created in the poem. And there is affinity between these two subjects, the creator I and the poet persona who speaks the poem. So taking into account this as a mode of criticism, we have seen that the German romantic critics gave some critical tools to the romantic critics of England, romantic writers of England. So first romantic critic, as we know, is William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth in his definition of poetry talks about two aspects. Number one, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, and number two, emotion recollected in tranquility. And these two are reconciled properly. Now our analysis will be on this, and we will see whether the poet Charlotte Smith has been able to reconcile the emotion recollected in tranquility with a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. The second romantic critic, of course, is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Samuel Taylor Coleridge said that the primary imagination that is there, the recognition of infinite I am that is present in all human beings, is different from the secondary imagination of the poet, because the secondary imagination of the poet can transport the readers into a world of awe and wonder, and capable of leaving the readers in a world of mystery. In Emily, Rousseau's Emily, French writer Rousseau's Emily, the education of man is related to the natural growth of man. So the adult man, the adult human being, is therefore born free, but is now shackled, grows up in the world of shackles. So he wanted to break those shackles and retain the primal innocence of man. So in poetry also we will have to look into this primal innocence of the poet in the creative process, whether this poet, as Coleridge has stated, is able to exercise the power of imagination, the secondary imagination, to dissolve, diffuse, dissipate in order to recreate. This depends on an affective development of a kind of world where the readers are transported into that romantic world and with a childlike sensibility responds to the world. So this world is a world of wonder, of mystery, and can always achieve a sense of sublime, as Kant has described sublime. So this sublimity of poetic expression depends on the spontaneity of expression, but also a conscious meditation on the part of the poet, where the language, diction, meter, all these are brought together in order to compose a poetic composition. Therefore, Coleridge demanded from his readers a willing suspension of disbelief for a moment. And he said that by suspending a sense of disbelief, the readers will try to trace a semblance of truth between what is presented by the poet and the subjective reality, the material reality in which the readers are engaged across time and space, across geopolitical locations. So through this bridging of the self with the world of the poem and tracing a semblance of truth between the subjective world of the reader and the subjective world that is presented, or the imaginative world that is presented in the poem will get its meaning. And therefore, after searching for this semblance of truth, according to Coleridge, the reader will come to encounter the truth itself, will understand the meaning. What is more important in romantic criticism is the act of recognition. It's the act, I repeat, of recognition. So we human beings can see things. We all have the primary imagination. A tree appears to us like a tree, a moon appears to us like a moon, a sun like a sun, a rainbow in the sky as a rainbow. What differentiates the romantic imagination or romantic poet or romantic criticism is to locate in the subject the consciousness, where the consciousness has a modifying power. Coleridge himself talked about this modifying power or modifying coloring of imagination. So he said that through association, assimilation, the poet's mind works, and through a certain coloring of imagination, through a modification, a poetry can succeed. So our task as a romantic critic will therefore be to judge the poem, taking into account the attempt by the poet to represent the emotion in its raw, spontaneous, natural way. But this has to be done with the help of language. So we have to bridge two aspects. One is the conscious craftsmanship, and number two, the spontaneity. John Keats talked about this. I said earlier that the mind of the poet should be in a state of mystery, because a poet is not a scientist. A poet cannot resolve things. So the Newtonian world that was there, the world of entire scientific enlightenment that was there, was disputed not only by William Blake, but also by John Keats, who said that this certainty principle in life should be disputed. And there is this art where the poet is able to create or stay in a world of perpetual mystery. A mind that is able to stay in that world of perpetual mystery, of uncertainty, is a mind that can create wondrous work of art. And this hankering after reason, hankering after resolution or synthesis, is the subterranean stream within the subconscious of the poet that must work together in order to bridge the communication gap between the reader and the poet. So this was what John Keats saw in poetry, and he said that fancy cannot cheat so well. So if you just become fanciful, Coleridge also differentiated between fancy and imagination. So John Keats also talked about this differentiation between fancy and imagination. And he said that fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Whatever is fanciful, fancy will remain momentary, short-lived, and just like a miracle, it can stay for some moments, but cannot stay for a longer duration of time. So in order to resolve that, the mind of the poet should get engaged in solving, and with the help of imagination, natural imagination, the poet must hanker after the truth. So beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is what he comes to the conclusion. And the Grecian urn, the Sylvan historian, has imprinted through art that world of beauty, beauty in perpetual uncertainty, or stasis. So stasis in Keatsian sense is also very dynamic, because the movement of this Cartesian axiomatic point of 0, 0, where x-axis or y-axis intersect, that particular point is unknown for the poet. So there is some movement always there in the poems of John Keats. So John Keats said that as leaf grows out of a tree, in the same way, a poem should grow. So imagination should work. Even Shelley also talks about this type of imagination, but imagination in close interconnectedness with reality. So taking into account these various trends of romantic criticism, we can come to this conclusion. More emphasis is given on the psychological process, on the subjectivity of the poet, on the subjective content of the poet, on the treatment of nature and the personified or metaphorical representation of nature, how the poem is able to generate a sense of awe and wonder, so that the readers with their childlike sensibility can look into this world, be transported into the world of the sublime, and by suspending their sense of disbelief for a moment, can understand a semblance of truth, and by understanding the semblance of truth, can recognize the truth that is inherent in the poem. So Charlotte Smith's poem, so if we read the poem, we find this fusion that has been made, the fusion between the world of the poet, the world of nature, and the absorption of the self into the image of the moon, or the absorption of moon into the self-consciousness of the poet. So this is seen. Number one, it is a subjective poem. Content is more important than the form. The form is very conscious form. The choice is conscious. A sonnet form is taken. So the poet is subjective and personal, using an autobiographical mode of sonnet form, and then translating that autobiographical mode into a highly structured artificial sonnet form. So if we focus primarily on content, we find that there is also an affinity of the poet, not only with nature, but also the common humanity. And there is a bridging of the sense with sensibility, sensibility with sensibility. So this bridging, as Kant has said, will constitute the appreciation of beauty. So here we have the representation of the Queen of the Silver Bow, where we have so many attributes given to Artemis or Diana, and through such attributes, we find the personified image of the moon, and moon, through such personification, almost becomes a presence in the poem. Things are otherwise fixed and dead, as Wordsworth has stated once. Things are otherwise fixed and dead, and it is the poet who has that power to give life into the world of things that are otherwise fixed and dead. So here, through the personification of moon, the romantic transfusion of moon as an animate, personified presence can be seen. So Charlotte Smith can be regarded as a romantic poet, and romantic criticism can aptly be applied to the analysis of the poem. So if you focus on her sense, feeling, tone, intention, and primarily focus on the content rather than on the form, we find that in spite of the artificial artifice of the sonnet, the poem also contains the subjective feelings of the poet in its original manner. So with the power of imagination, the moon is no longer the moon that we see on the sky, and this moon is transported or transformed into another realm, transformed into another identity. So this is there in this poem. So after romantic criticism, we also have the Victorian criticism. Victorian criticism is a continuity of the romantic criticism. So as far as Victorian critics are concerned, we have a kind of continuity of romanticism among the Victorian critics, but also a relocation of the text in the dominant culture of the age. Victorian period has often been called the age of doubt and faith, of skepticism, because of the science that has come, of the faith in the God, because of the revival of new spirituality that can be found in movements like Oxford movement, a return to nature as is found in the pre-Raphaelite movement. And towards the end of the Victorian period, we also have the development of symbolical imagination in the works of the last poets of the Victorian period. So we have Victorian criticism that, first of all, uses in Arnoldian sense the touchstone method. You know what is touchstone method? So best of the lines taken from the classics will be taken, and those lines will be set to judge the lines of the poem. And if the poem line matches with the excellent lines culled from the classic, time-tested classic, then through this touchstone, you can come to this conclusion that yes, this poem is good or bad. So this is what Arnold suggested. And Arnold also talked about the continuation of the Renaissance, the tradition of the neoclassical enlightenment in the contemporary poets as well as the romantic poets. So we have Victorian criticism primarily focused on a kind of balance between the genre, form, as well as on the content, and new interest in society, civilization, culture also cropped in the Victorian criticism. Victorian criticism does not have any kind of new insight into it doesn't offer any kind of new insight into the analysis of poetry, but it reverts back, goes back to the neoclassical norms. It is trying to balance in some way the continuity of romantic criticism with the old found or old formed neoclassical criticism. So this balancing can also be applied to the understanding of this poem, where we have a genre like sonnet that is used by Charlotte Smith, and how this sonnet form has been used to its full potentiality by Charlotte Smith. After this Victorian criticism, towards the end of Victorian period, we gradually find that there are new types of criticism that we call today as modernist criticism. Modernist criticism includes, towards the end of the 19th century, first engagement with different movements art movements. So you know the different movements in art. First, it started with realism. After realism, we have a modification of realism, and a new kind of realism was social realism. A new kind of realism was social realism, where the interconnectedness between the aesthetics of art or literature was connected to the social realities. So we call this social realism. So this social realism was also a mode of looking at this, looking at reality. So realism was basically a painted picture, well framed, and the portrait of the subject was clearly placed in the best form. The entire world of pastoral poetry, even Victorian poems or romantic poems that are set in a pastoral world, are framed in this realism. Even Wordsworth's definition talks about this realism when he talks about the aesthetic purification of language really used by men. And through this purification, you filter out the best of the language and represent in poetry the subject, so that the subject satisfies the interest of the readers. Coleridge said that there is a contradiction in this theory of poetry, because the due process of filtration of language is actually the transformation of the prosaic ordinary conversational language into something poetic and metrical. And through this filtration, the leftovers of language, the raw leftovers of language, these are basically the residual components of language. Therefore, poetry is well constructed, highly poetical, as well as metrical, according to Samuel Taylor Coleridge. But we see that in the late 18th century, late 19th century, we have the development of alternative forms of realism. So first it was realism, aesthetic realism. Realism was disputed by romanticism. Romanticism was again disputed by new form of social realism that tried to include the social aspect, as in the works of Charles Dickens, Makepeace Thackeray. We have the works of Thomas Hardy and the entire Victorian novelists, especially the women novelists like Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte. So a fusion between romanticism as well as feminism with the newfound social realism and psychological realism. So this was there in the new kind of social realism that we find in the mid-Victorian period gradually developing. This was, however, challenged by a new way of looking at art that is called naturalism. Naturalism did not provide artistic critical tools for us, but it provided definite forms of art. So it was not a unified movement once again. So the writers who are working in the field of naturalism were primarily influenced by the painting of Van Gogh, whose famous painting of a pair of boots that represented and broke the frame which included the aesthetic representation of reality, and brought into the frame the things that are actually rejected, the raw things that are filtered out through this aesthetic purification. And he brought these raw things that were kept outside into the frame. So everything that is natural was brought into the frame. Now you may ask that naturalism was there in romanticism, but I will just simply dispute, because naturalism is a movement in literature and art that is inclusive, while romanticism is not talking about inclusiveness of everything in the gamut of literature. Although the purpose of Wordsworth, the intention of Wordsworth was to include everything in the realm of literature, in the realm of poetry. Only in a few writers like William Blake, William Cooper, we find the inclusion of things that were otherwise relegated to the margin or kept outside the frame. Naturalism as a movement, as found in the works of Zola, works of Franz Kafka, works of even playwrights like George Bernard Shaw, Henrik Ibsen before Shaw, in the works of John Galsworthy, tried to or attempted to represent life as it is. Okay, without any kind of filtration, life as it is. So Anton Chekhov, towards the end of 19th century, early 20th century, was working in Russia and was trying to represent reality in its original form. So it is in Soviet Republic was called as typichnost. Typichnost means typical activities, typical character drawn from typical situation and placed in typical event. So that is represented. So a real slice of life. So if life is a loaf of bread, you cut that loaf of bread into slices, and after cutting that bread into slices, you take one slice and you get the life. All the ingredient and the components of life can be seen in this slice, single slice of the bread. So we have slice of life reality. Art cannot include everything. Anton Chekhov said that art is objective. Art cannot include everything, but art can be representative. Art can be typical. Art can be, therefore, inclusive, even when it is a slice of life. So we have these two formulations. One is life as it is. The other is slice of life reality that is presented by naturalism. Naturalism was further modified by a new concept called new naturalism. New naturalism talked about the authentication of reality especially in theater. Antoine was working in French theater, so where everything should be presented as if it is happening. So if a play is to be performed on the stage, 3 hours of real lifetime should be there on the stage. It should not be kind of representation of a single revolution of the sun, the entire day event, or say 20 years, 30 years brought together into a structure, but rather the realism will be very close. It is not a simple surface realism, but psychological realism and true to life realism. So even when the actors were being prepared to perform the play, Antoine said that I will not tell you which wall will be open to the audience. So there are 4 walls, you understand, the left wing, the right wing, the back wall, and the front line. So that is open, transparent line through which the spectators can see the play. So this rectangular box, the walls, the 4 walls of the box were kept as if the walls are there. And the actors who are situated in that environment, in that section, will represent the play in such a realistic way, in such a new naturalistic way, and the value of art will depend on that. Say if a carcass is to be shown on the stage, he said that a real carcass should be brought on the stage. If blood is to be shown, you should bring real blood on the stage. So if light source has to be shown, the real light source has to be shown on the stage. So costuming should also be like that, real life costuming. So in Russia also this was worked on. In France, Germany, we have the development of this new type of realistic art. So this realistic art also gave some scope for the critics who started tracing realism in art. So let us read this poem, keeping in mind the new forms of isms, ideological concepts of literature that developed with reference to Charlotte Smith's To the Moon. So we find that, yes, unlike the other romantic poets where everything is presented in almost a surreal or vague term, here we have a concretization of reality in its own crude form, where the suffering humanity, the sublunary world, these are presented as if they are real. A slice of life reality without any kind of distortion is presented in the poem. So if we apply these new kind of art forms that gradually develop during the late Victorian period, we find that, yes, this work is a work of new naturalism, and a modification on romanticism. A new form of female romanticism can be seen in the works, as in the works of Jane Austen. Jane Austen is a realistic writer, so she's a romantic novelist, but as a romantic novelist, she is the most realistic of novelists. Even in 21st century, when we appreciate the works of Jane Austen, we appreciate her, as Tony Tanner has said, because of her social realism. She has painted a world 2 inches wide, but the 2 inches wide ivory is excellently carved. So there is no mistake in her representation of reality. That naturalism is there in the work of Jane Austen. So that type of realism can be seen in the works of Charlotte Smith too. Especially in her novels, we find this. Female poets during that period were condemned, were regarded as subliterary, they were regarded as inferior writers. But as far as realism is concerned, naturalism is concerned, realistic and psychological portrayal of portrayal of reality is concerned, we find that these writers are better than the male writers, even better than, say, John Keats or, say, Byron, as far as social reality is concerned. So some precursors to Romanticism like William Blake, William Cooper, they are exceptions. Even Chatterton, yeah, that sad story of Chatterton influenced a lot of Romantic poets, and the graveyard poets later on also developed this obsession with this thought of death, elegies. And Charlotte Smith also represents that elegiac undertone that is prevalent in this poem. This obsession with death, elegy, also marks a new beginning in Romantic period. We also find this obsession with death present in the second generation of Romantic poets who unfortunately died young. And even in those days, at that young, tender age, they could write such excellent poetry and focusing on the theme of death. Perhaps these works were the works of the second generation of Romantic poets were influenced by the works of the pre-Romantic poets like William Blake, the graveyard poets Thomas Gray, Robert Graves, or even Goldsmith, Chatterton, Collins. So we have this representation of reality in its exact form. Then came a movement called symbolism in poetry. Symbolism in poetry, usually in literary criticism, it shaped itself around a work published by Arthur Symons. Arthur Symons in the year 1890 published the book called The Symbolist Movement in Literature, in Poetry. So he was mainly analyzing the poems of the French poets. So Mallarmé, Verlaine, Baudelaire, these were the main poets whom he was analyzing. And Arthur Symons was a scholar on the works of William Blake. So he was trying to trace this tradition of symbology in poetry. Symbolism constitutes the core of Romantic poetry, as we find in the works of Charlotte Smith. So if we apply the rules laid down by Arthur Symons, of course, ignored the female poets of the previous generation. He did not even talk about Elizabeth Barrett Browning as a poet, or about Emily Bronte, who wrote excellent Gondal poems. Jane Austen also wrote poems. Dorothy Wordsworth also wrote poems. So we hardly know about these female poets writing during the Romantic period. Charlotte Smith was an early poet of the Romantic period. So these poets were ignored by Arthur Symons, but whatever forms of symbology that he found in the works of William Blake and the French poets can be applied to any kind of analysis of this work by Charlotte Smith. So this poem can be regarded as symbolic poem. I hope you will agree with me. Your analysis also has shown that this poem is a symbolic poem. Symbolic poem also depends on another form of representation. So that developed in the early 20th century, that is called imagism. Imagism in poetry. And this imagism depends on the imagistic details. Ezra Pound and his school influenced the works. This is an American school of poetry, imagism, that gradually developed. And through imagism, we have the representation of the natural world, of the world that is there, the urban and the rural world, with imagistic details. As we have already learned, that imagery talks about two aspects. One is organic one, the other is inorganic or conceptual. So both these are combined together in kind of a synesthesia in the works of the imagistic poets. And imagism is therefore the hallmark of the new type of poetry. Ezra Pound in his manifesto also talked about the modernist element. See how gradually modernism is shaping itself in poetry. And if we try to analyze Charlotte Smith's To the Moon, keeping in mind the tenets of imagism or imagist movement in poetry, we find that excellent imagery is woven in the poem. In the first stanza, we have the imagery of sorrow, pensiveness, solitary world of the moon. And this is combined with the imagery of dream, surreal imagery, the shadow trembling on the stream, floating clouds that cross thy way. See how excellent synesthesia is done in this first stanza of the poem. So imagistic details, when we read Eliot's poems like Preludes or say Wasteland, the Wasteland, we have this type of imagery. Even in the works of James Joyce, we have this imagery. So the feeble lantern, so the street lights are imagined as personified people who are holding the feeble lanterns in their hand as the evening sets down. So remember the opening lines of J. Alfred Prufrock. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread against the sky like the patient etherized on a table. So that is also there. So let us go then, you and I, when the evening is set against the sky, like a patient etherized on a table. Entire imagery is therefore representing the consciousness of the person, of the speaker of this poem. Here, Charlotte Smith is also weaving such an excellent image. If you just go through the poem, you find this use of imagery in this poem. So in the first quatrain, as I said, first quatrain represents the imagery of the moon. Moon is there placed on the lunar world of the sky, dark night, and the pale beam alone pensive. So emotional or emotive allusions are there. Then there is this movement of straying, watching. So shadow trembling in the stream. See the image, shadow trembling in the stream. So this can be compared to Kubla Khan. So we have the dome floated in the mid-air. So the reflection of the dome is seen on the water alf that suddenly emerges. And then there is this floating cloud. So what are the main images that are used? First, if we look at the sensory images, so it is visual, Queen of the Silver Bow, we can see. Then we have the pale beam, alone and pensive. So there is some kind of sorrow, conceptual sorrow attributed, loneliness, solitude, melancholy. These are conceptual. And then there is this imagery of movement, kinesthetic, I delight to stray. And then there is this shadow imagery of visually perceptible, shadow trembling in the stream. And then there is the kinesthetic image of floating clouds that cross the way. So in this opening quatrain itself, we have a combination of 4 images, conceptual and organic, and there is a synesthesia of the images. The entire picture almost resembles a kind of painting, a painting that has proper detailing, and the detailing depends on the visualization of the moon with reference to the clouds and the shadow trembling in the stream. That image is there. In the second stanza, we have the imagery again of the visual imagery. I gaze. Gazing itself is used as a trope. I gaze, thy mild and placid light. So imagery of light. Then there is this mellowing down of the light, sheds a soft calm upon my troubled breast. So the conceptual image of the troubled breast is combined with the soft calm, again conceptual image, but it also produces a kind of tenderness. As far as the sensory image is concerned, we have the touch of tenderness, a soft, tender, tactile sensation is generated through the use of the word soft. And after I think, fair planet of the night, again the visual image is there, and thy orb, the wretched may have rest. So we have this wretched of the earth, again the concept that is related to the orb. Orb is again a visual image. In the third stanza, again, we have the image of the sufferers of the earth, that is conceptually as well as visually perceptible. And then there is the image of death, D in capital letters, personified death. In Shakespearean sonnets, death appears as a personified image, and death has come to drag the young man away, or the poet away. So death appears here again in the poem as a personified image. It is also related to the concept of death. So death appears, released by death. The action is related to death, as if death is there, acting out, releasing someone. And then there is this benignant sphere, as opposed to the malignant sphere in the sublunary world. So we have this death symbology extended as an image, conceptual image, also related to the personified image of death, that is related to the action of the death. So death is taking away the sufferers of the earth into the lunary world, in the luminous semi-luminous, semi-transparent, luminous world of the moon. And finally, we have the sad children of despair and woe. Again, conceptual. So despair and woe, children of despair and woe. So see how the personification is working. So despair and woe, parents of sad children. See how nice the entire trope is built up. The word children is associated with the children of despair and woe. So through this simple personification of despair and woe, again kept in capital letters, the words despair and woe both are kept in capital letter. So despair and woe, the parents have produced children, therefore the children are sad. And despair and woe through personification appear visually as characters. So we have this perception of this despair and woe as visibly present, visual images there, but also including the concept of despair and woe producing the sad children. Then there is this memory, forget in thee, the cup of sorrow. Cup of sorrow is a metaphor, cup of sorrow. So like the cup of sorrow. Okay, like a cup, like some container filled with sorrow. So see how this is condensed into a trope, into a metaphor, cup of sorrow. I refer to this cup allusion that talks about the chalice, usually chalice that contains the blood of Christ. Yeah, the wine of life, the main nectar of life, that is replaced by the cup of sorrow. So here we have a kind of metaphor that actually alludes to another metaphor of the chalice. And here we have the sorrowful existence of human beings that is foregrounded. And finally, we have the imagery of a poor, wearied pilgrim in this toiling scene. Is the scene toiling? So we have a transferred epithet. So many figures of speech are used in this poem. So in the last line, we have this figurative use, transfer of the word toiling. Who is toiling? Actually, the pilgrim is toiling. And the scene is a tragic scene, a scene of suffering and toil. So scene is now being qualified or described with the help of the word toiling. So this poor person is a wearied pilgrim. Pilgrim is a person who journeys. So journey metaphor is used in order to explain. So we have a kinesthesia of movement to the word pilgrim, and then we have this visual image of a poor and wearied pilgrim. So what I was trying to say was that symbology and imagistic criticism both can be applied to the analysis of Charlotte Smith's poem. So can we say then that this poem is a modern poem? These are all modernist elements, much appreciated by the modernist critics. After modernism, after symbolism and imagism, we have definitely a form of criticism called formalist criticism. Formalist criticism started in Russia, and Russian critics, Czechoslovakian critics, they all started integrating the analysis of literature with the language. They say that without thought, language is not possible, and without language, thought is also not possible. So in order to analyze any kind of work, literary work, more emphasis should be placed on language. More emphasis should be placed on the composition, the form. And through this analysis, we can come to this conclusion. So I said that I will just take a 1 hour class. So with this, I can come to a conclusion that Charlotte Smith's poem not only qualifies to be analyzed as a romantic poem, it also qualifies to be analyzed as a modern poem. And even post-structuralist linguistic criticism, post-structuralist criticism like the feminist criticism, post-colonial criticism. So post-colonial criticism is very difficult to add here, post-colonial criticism. In some other works of Charlotte Smith, of course, there is this Orientalism, the world of Orientalism that is there in Charlotte Smith's work. But there is also the antithesis. Two complementary words are presented even in a set of contrary in this work. So these forms of criticism that develop, new historicism can be a very good critical tool to analyze this poem. We have been applying new historicist reading of the poems of William Blake. Marxist criticism should be applied to the analysis of Charlotte Smith's poem because she is perhaps the first female poet who is talking about class, about the poor people, about the proletariat about those in the margins. So we do not have any English poet writing about the margins. Even the male poets, they are not writing about the margins. The deserted village is an exception. Okay, deserted village. Some poems of William Cooper also shows us the presence of the other half, the starving half, the have-nots. We have the presence of the have-nots in the poems of William Blake. So apart from these pre-romantic poets, we also have the presence of the have-nots, the starving, toiling, working class in the poems of Wordsworth. Say, for example, in Michael, in Leech Gatherer. We have the presence of such characters in the works of Shelley, the England 1819. So we have such presence. But usually English poetry is elitist. Most of the English poets, before say Louis Macnish, most of the English poets are elitist. They talk about their class. But here we have Charlotte Smith, who is talking about a class of her own, a class of the lower middle class, class of the proletariat. And this we will find again in the works of Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft was also a person, although she was married to William Godwin, she had to struggle very hard throughout her life in order to search for a livelihood. And as I told you, Charlotte Smith also had to work very hard. Her husband went into a bankruptcy, and as you have said, that she has also had to suffer in the prison house because of debt, and she had to look after her children, 12 children she had to look after. She took to writing in order to support her family, and found that novel writing is a favorable genre. In her novels also we have this realistic portrait of a lower middle class life that we do not find in the works of other writers. Although Dickens, Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, they have also presented the world of the proletariat, of the subaltern, but there we have more dramatization, more theater than reality. So with these words, I conclude that Charlotte Smith's poem is indeed a modernist poem with abundant romantic elements that qualifies it to be a feminist romantic poem. So now you can pose your questions, keeping in mind the time. So just 1 hour, I just complete. Any questions if you have to ask, you can ask and discuss, and we will bring her closer to the text. Yes, any question? Everyone is sleeping. So I thought that, so this monologic lecture makes everyone sleep. Wake up, students.
No, sir.
No, sir.
It's not sleep, sir. It's too much information to process at once.
So I will upload this lecture on the YouTube, okay, with your kind permission, even the previous one. So
Yes,
if you
sir.
want to go
Obviously.
revisit the lectures, you can revisit lecture. If you have any questions
Okay, sir.
related to the text, you can ask now. Next day, we will introduce another great romantic writer, Charles Lamb. Okay, next day, tomorrow.
Sir, what do we have of Charles Lamb?
Charles Lamb prose you have. So I have not yet selected the prose. I will first give the introduction to the works of Charles Lamb. So I am planning to take up In Praise of the Chimney Sweepers. So would you like to read that one, In Praise of Chimney Sweepers?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Have you read that in the graduation?
Yeah.
Have you read that in
No,
the
sir.
graduation?
No, sir.
No, sir.
Yes, sir.
No, no,
Yes,
Yes,
no,
sir. We
sir.
have read Dream Children, I think.
Yes, sir. We
Yes,
have.
sir. We have read.
Another
In
one.
Praise of the
Chimney
In
sweeper
Praise of
there.
Chimney Sweeper, anyone has read in the graduation In Praise of Chimney Sweepers by Charles Lamb?
এটা ছিল না
In Praise of Chimney Sweepers.
No, no. No, sir. No, sir. No, sir.
No, sir. We have
Your
not read that one.
Okay, you have read Dream Children, Superannuated Man. You have not read In
Only
Praise
Dream
of Chimney Sweeper.
Children.
Then I can take up In Praise of Chimney Sweeper. One essay I have to take up with you. Okay, so next day we will have.
Yes, sir. Charles Lamb's essays are very good.
Actually, sir, I
very
heard about
simple
it.
and very
I
easy to
didn't
understand.
read. Yeah.
Who, Charles Lamb? So again, a great romantic writer. You cannot just simply say that he's a very simple writer.
No, not
Very interesting.
simple. No, he is not Matthew Arnold. That's what I'm saying.
What did Matthew Arnold do to you? He's also a very good poet.
Age
You're
of
welcome.
Modernism. Matthew
Okay, any
Arnold,
question from the
Modernism.
text? Any question from Charlotte Smith? So I stop recording so that you can converse with me, and then I'm stopping recording. Okay, thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, sir.